Because I think the title, Do I Know You, I think that specifically relates to face blindness, right? For the most part.
Yeah, absolutely. Face blindness, I think, is my most interesting disorder because I think for neurotypical people, it's hard to understand what it means.
Hi, this is Chris, and welcome to the very first episode of the Dragon Tree Podcast. I recently had a chance to sit down and speak with author Sadie Dingfelder about her new book, Do I Know You? You might know Sadie's work from the Washington Post, National Geographic magazine, and other great publications. I highly recommend her book, which is a fascinating journey into neurodiversity. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. So you're telling me about the long and winding road to publishing this book.
Yeah, I started out writing more just straightforward, funny stories, sort of in the style of David Sedaris. And I sent that, and I wrote a whole book because I was told you had to do that on spec, basically. And I sent that to various agents. And I got two positive responses, one from a DC agent, one from a New York one. And the New York lady, the DC agent was like, I don't really understand the point. Like, you need a through line. You need a point here. You're not. And I'm like, the point is I'm wacky and hilarious, you know? But she really had a good point because whenever I sent these stories out to my friends, who also, like, a lot of them happen to be award-winning journalists, they would say the same thing. They'd be like, something is missing from this story. Like, why are you making all these weird mistakes? Why, why did you fail to recognize your own husband or your own brother or mother? These kinds of questions just kept coming up. And then another breakthrough moment was this agent in New York emailed me back and she's like, I kind of like this, but I think you should write a popular science memoir mashup like Hope Jaron. Have you heard of her? Her book is called Lab Girl, and it is it's stunning. It's a beautiful book, and it is in a genre that I think she may have invented, where it's a popular science and memoir just mashed together.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, and I thought, wow, I didn't know this was an option. But once I thought about it, I thought, this is what I did sort of in my face blindness story for the Washington Post. And anyway, long story short, I went back to that story and I went back to all of the emails that I had gotten in response to it, emails that had asked me lots of questions. I mean, I got tons of emails from people who said, this reminds me of myself, this reminds me of my aunt and my uncle. But I also got emails that asked me questions like, have you heard of something called SDAM? Have you heard of aphantasia? Yeah. And I had not heard of any of these things, but I also was very bored at that moment with writing about myself. And so I ignored all those things at the time in 2019. But then when the pandemic hit and then I got laid off, I started to return to these questions and enroll myself in studies again. So even before I had a book deal, I was reaching out to professors, just sort of flailing around to see what was there, to try to learn about myself and to see if there might be some other stories there. And I quickly discovered that I am so neurodivergent that I can immediately interest many researchers. Like, they didn't care that I might consider writing about them in the future. They were like, oh, like, you're stereo blind. We need you in our office immediately. Can you spend 20 hours in this fMRI machine? That's probably another reason why they really liked me, is because I'm more driven to be a good participant than your average.
The incentive.
So it's funny because I think my experience about my inner monologue, I'm sure, is always going on sort of underneath the surface of my awareness. And so in some ways it's harder to quiet, I think, than perhaps a person who is consciously aware of their inner monologue. But if I do sit quietly for long enough, it does bubble up to the surface. My main problem, though, with meditation is that I just fall asleep.
Right. Yeah. And that comes up. So now let's, if we could just for people who haven't read the book, And I strongly urge everyone to go out and read this book. It's fantastic. So there's a constellation of issues that were unearthed through this whole journey, that the book really is a journey, and of self-discovery. But like I said, I think it actually turns a mirror on the audience too, and the reader, and maybe, hey, there's so many things I didn't know about myself. So, but just keeping the focus on you for a minute, you make so. You're going to have to help me again with this.
Prosopagnosia. You can just say face blindness.
Face blind is the alternate way of saying that. But you make a distinction between three types of just that. That's just one of setting all the other constellation aside. There's the developmental face blindness, let's just call it, which is the most common, probably, if I have that right. The acquired face blindness, which is a little bit less common. Then there's, and I'm going to chop this up, but metamorphosia, which is like the least common, right?
Yes.
And a very rare, actually, that latter one. So I was wondering, could you just kind of explain the difference and just kind of set the table for what we'll be talking about here with the main, because I think the title, Do I Know You? I think that specifically relates to face blindness, right? For the most part.
Yeah, absolutely. Face blindness, I think, is my most interesting disorder, because I think for neurotypical people, it's hard to understand what it means. But what it means is I can see faces just as clearly as anyone can. I mean, my visual acuity is basically fine, but my perception of faces is very different from other humans. And I also just don't remember people's faces. And I keep on trying to come up with examples that would make sense to people. Like if I showed you a lot of seashells of the same species, and then, if I showed you a seashell and then I showed you a lineup of seashells, like you probably would not be able to pick out like a seashell from a lineup of similar looking seashells. And I have seashells and I've been working on this demonstration. But
for your TED Talk, for your pending TED Talk, right?
Right, exactly. Even though all those seashells are unique, they have different stripes, but you can't remember it. And that's what faces are like to me. Everyone has two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. There's nothing that distinctive. So unless you're David Bowie and have two different colored eyes or something, or some facial scar, I am going to have a lot of trouble distinguishing you from other people who are in your generic category.
Right.
I think there's actually a lot of research into face blindness across ethnicities. That's super interesting. Okay. And babies are not any better at recognizing faces of their own race than faces of other races until like some surprisingly young age. Like they start to get better all of a sudden at, I want to say like 4 months or 6 months. Yes, that's right. And they're also, they're also able to, babies can tell the difference between individual monkey faces.
That's interesting.
At first, early in their development, at about 3 months, and then at 6 months, they've lost that ability. So everyone has, not everyone, primates and humans both have this special part in your brain called the fusiform face area, where a sort of basic template. Can you hear my cat? She's annoying. Okay.
Oh, anyway. There she is.
So everyone has this basic template of a face, which is just so basic. It seems to be just two dots over a line. We're born with that. And we orient to anything that looks like that, and not to the upside down version of that, interestingly.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So babies, I mean, really, right? There's a great video of this monkey just locking onto faces right after birth.
Wow.
So everyone has that in both, that our fusiform face area needs lots and lots of experience to tune to the specific variances of the faces that you specifically are being exposed to. So actually face recognition ability doesn't peak until your 30s.
That I found interesting. I thought that would have been one of those early developmental things, but yeah.
Yeah,
30.
No, little kids are not great at face recognition. So I think that's why I didn't realize I was so much worse than everyone else, because everyone is pretty bad for a while. Sure. And also, children don't care if you fail to recognize them as individuals until, probably 6th grade-ish. And that was exactly when I started having trouble making friends, because I couldn't tell people apart.
There's a certain point that locked in for me in the book where you're like, and maybe this is more towards later in high school and college, because you do sort of track your life, by way of face blindness, which is such an interesting approach. But at one point you're like, you get to this point where who are these people? Like, who are these tedious people who keep coming up to me?
Even long before I thought I realized that I wasn't recognizing people, I did notice that everyone seemed to know me and I didn't really know them. I remember at my bat mitzvah looking out at the audience and just thinking, I don't know any of these people.
Wow.
And they were, and that actually is a story that did not make it into the book, which is I invited a dozen stranger children to my bat mitzvah because I didn't have any friends.
Oh, interesting.
My only sort of friend was my next door neighbor, who was 2 years younger than me. And my mom had planned this whole party, and she was like, all you have to do is bring me some addresses. Bring me the addresses of your friends. She assumed I had friends. Right. And if I didn't bring them to her, I was going to get grounded. So I ran to my...
So on pain of grounding, you had to do this.
I had to somehow find at least a dozen friends in like a matter of hours. Right. So I went to my one friend's house. Luckily, she lived next door. And I said... I was just crying. I was like, what am I going to do? And I remember we were playing with those stupid little Breyer ponies,
Yeah, sure.
Actually,
I had a sister,
And we were using her temple directory as the jump for the little ponies to jump over.
Oh, when directories were a thing, yeah.
Yeah. And she went to a different synagogue than I went to. So she said, why don't we just invite my entire, 4th grade class?
Oh, that's a good friend right there.
And I was like, you are a genius. And so I just copied the temple directory and gave it to my mom. I had no reason to believe that these children would show up. They've never heard of me in their lives. It was great because they were all younger than me. So they were nicer. Oh. They weren't like at middle school age.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And I had friends for one night. It was delightful. It was like a miracle. And I didn't get grounded.
Oh, nice. And see, a lot of people would have maybe thought something of that, but it sounds like that was a positive experience. In all, it was obviously very stressful, but.
It was so stressful at the moment when I thought that I was going to have to admit to my parents that I was a total loser with no friends. Or I was going to get, and I was in trouble with my mom, and my mom is terrifying when she's angry. So it was stressful in the moment, and it was a memorable incident for my life. But what I took from it was not, isn't this weird I don't have any friends? Or isn't it weird that I can't recognize everyone in this synagogue who claims to know me? But what my experience from it was like, oh, I'm such a good, scrappy problem solver.
That was my first impulse, is you figured it out. With the help of your friend, but and that's actually a theme that comes up again and again, is you working around things, so that by this point in your life, it's sort of, I guess, counterintuitively given you maybe this confidence level and this comfortability with ambiguity, which is just, most people don't have. So it's sort of like maybe you have this superpower that a lot of people don't have by the age of in 30s and 40s. Yeah.
I think that it's true.
I'm skipping ahead.
No, I think it's so true that I do not need the level of predictability in my environment that most people need. And what one thing that was a recent experience is, my husband is also very, he's creative and sort of go with the flow person. But I remember when we were getting married, we were sitting in our apartment, and Steve, it was right before we were in our outfits. We were about to walk down the aisle, and he's like, where are we going again? And I said, I don't really know. I'm waiting for the text message to tell me.
Right. So, it's like, please don't get lost. Please don't get lost. Please don't get lost. I can just see you
Right.
You don't have much of an inner monologue, but I can see it really bubbling up at that point. Yeah.
No, I really didn't. I wasn't worried about it. I wasn't worried
good.
about it. I knew that it would be fine. But Steve seemed to think that we should know where all of our friends and family were gathered.
You're like, it'll work itself out.
I was like, God, you're such a control freak.
Oh my gosh. Poor Steve. Well, it's funny because now that's a fresh perspective on a different story that's in the book, is that you don't remember very much of anything of your wedding, right? Like,
yeah.
Did I read that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember. So what I learned about myself in this book is that, well, this is in almost every case, it's me learning about myself, but it's also me learning something about everyone else, because I didn't realize that everyone else pretty much remembers things in a sensory manner, where obviously not everything, but the big moments from your life, the big emotional moments, people can sort of relive. And this is described very beautifully by Proust in Remembrance of a Thing's Past, where he bites into that Madeline and it brings back this like flood of sensory memories from his childhood.
With zero grammar. Or with zero punctuation. Not grammar. He's great at grammar. Zero punctuation.
Yeah. And it brings back this flood of memories. And, I had read that at some point in my life, and I thought, ooh, what an artistic thought. It wouldn't, but I didn't really realize that happened for people on a literal level. Because for me, the only way I store stories is store memories as stories.
Right.
My brain, I almost may have just read a biography of myself, because my brain does not hold on to those sensory moments, and my brain doesn't bundle them together in a way that allows me to recall them like neurotypical brains do. And this is called severely deficient autobiographical memory. But yes, damn. And
the guy doesn't regret calling it that? I love that the guy who coined it is like, please stop using that.
He definitely said that to me because I have it on tape, but he doesn't remember saying it to me, interestingly.
Yeah.
So, once you commit to an acronym, and it makes sense why he chose it, because it's the opposite of something called HSAM, which is highly superior autobiographical memory. And those are those people who can remember every moment from their life almost. You can say, like, what did you have for breakfast on January 5th, 1980? And they can tell you. Yeah. They can tell you what day of the week it was without doing calculations. They can tell you what the weather was like. And it's so funny to me that that's considered highly superior, because that is not a functional
curse,
way to...
Right?
Yeah, it sounds like a terrible, terrible curse.
Well, because they get stuck in the past, right? Isn't that what he said? And that's something you do not suffer from, right?
No problem being in the present, because that is the only world I am sensorially, that's not really a word, aware of.
Nice. We're coining words as we go. Yeah, it does sound like a curse. I've heard of what's the actress, Mary Lou Henner, I think, from Taxi.
Oh, wow.
Has that where she can literally tell you what she wore on a certain day, whatever. And it's just, I always thought that stuff would just get jumbled up in your mind that way. So that seems like the opposite problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So what there's a trade-off. And in fact, in a lot of systems in our brain, there's interesting trade-offs that you have to make. So the question is, what matters more, the detail of an individual event or looking for regularities across different events? Mm-hmm. And so for instance, like if I went on like a walk with someone who has HSAM and we see someone get bit by a dog, that person is going to remember so many things that I'm not, like where everyone was standing, where the dog bit the person on their body, the breed of the dog, how many people were there, the weather, incidental things, the temperature, what people were wearing.
And you're just like, who cares? Like, why would I remember all that stuff?
Right. My brain, actually, I think of my brain as sort of a very lazy, like, boss or executive.
Just tell me the bottom line.
Yeah. All I need is the bottom line. Like, someone got bit. But what the advantage for having a brain like mine is that I might be able to, since I'm only pulling out the details that I think are the most important, I can look across events, across specific moments, and see regularities more clearly than a normal person can. And I think that actually can help you if like me, well, so I obviously know that I'm not going to remember things like my wedding. Like even before I realized I had this problem, I just had a desire and a drive to write things down. Yeah, I actually just wrote about myself for National Geographic. In the print edition, I'm getting like 3 pages, including an illustration of my face.
That is amazing. And I think you even mentioned that, pardon me if I'm taking this out of context. I think it was
Sure,
on
sure.
LinkedIn. I think it was on LinkedIn where you were commenting on it. You said, I'm so glad I got this in the print edition. So I think it was your grandma or somebody could see it.
Oh,
Because you talk about so
yeah.
affectionately about your grandma towards the end of the book. And she's
So
got
what
great
this
memory. I mean, from your perspective, she's like, she can remember people like her address from New Jersey from 1940s or whatever it was, and it's like, you're like standing in amazement while everyone else is worried about a possible mental decline with your grandma. I thought that was so funny because you're like, I would kill to have this kind of memory.
My grandma's amazing. I will find old videos of her and her cousins from, I mean, this was like, I don't know how she had a video camera, how someone had a video camera, because this is old jerky,
Like
you know,
60s, like, was that Super 8
older. They're
kind
like
of?
black. Yeah, they're black and white. It's like the
Oh,
oldest thing you've ever seen in your life.
wow.
And yeah, and it's like her cousins, and she can name them all. And she
That's
had
what
a
you were saying.
ton.
Yeah, yeah.
She had a ton of cousins.
That is
She's telling me,
amazing.
yeah. And I'm truly amazed. I do know that as people get older, interestingly, your more recent memories are the ones you lose faster. Your oldest
Mm,
memories are stay in your brain. But also, you actually do tilt towards the SDAM side of the scale. So as
I see.
people get older, they're more likely to remember their memories as stories instead of as sensory experiences that bundled together that they can sort of re-experience.
I see. Well, and I mean, throughout most people's lives, they're somewhere in the middle. I mean, because these are
Yeah.
two ends of a spectrum, right?
Right. And most people are in the middle and they strike a balance between those two
Right.
things.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting how the brain just knows. Because I mean, to me, like you say, the long term, and I know you're right because I know I've seen that before, where it's like the long term memories kind of stay while the short term ones are the first to leave. But at some point, those long term memories were short term memories, and I don't know if
Yeah.
that's more when you were younger and they just stick better or what. But anyway, I didn't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but that's so interesting. There's if you read Sadie's book, which is, we should remind the audience, is called "Do I Know You?" It's going to be
Thank you.
wherever you can buy books starting June 25th. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, June
So
25th,
soon.
2024. Yeah, I know. We're so excited because you got two book events, which we'll talk about later and coming up as well. But, but like, yeah, I mean, so I want to get back to something, if you don't mind, you just were talking about with, the and I'm trying to keep this also chronological because that's how the book is laid out, which is so interesting. But the fact that the neurons I'm not an expert, so please tell me if I'm getting the wording wrong. But the neurons in your brain, or a person like your brain, they make interesting connections, right? So it's like you make the point of like direct flights versus like making a connection, right? So like the hub and spoke network of like an airline, right? So in your so you might have a neuron or a neural network in your mind that goes from like LA, a direct flight to Tampa. Whereas if you're just trying to go from LA to San Francisco, you might have to go to Chicago, then to Tampa, then to like Maine or something, and then back to San Francisco. And do you think that plays into like what you were talking about earlier, as far as like what you're what you think you're good at, or what you've identified that you're good at, which is telling stories and making deeper connections, I think is the way you put it, than maybe most people could in that sense.
I think that, yeah. So the one thing that's interesting is we have all these labels for all of these neurodivergences, like autism and ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, my prosopagnosia, all my things are, but most people qualify for multiple labels.
Mm,
And scientists are beginning to think that maybe these labels don't have roots in physical reality. Maybe they're more like social constructs.
interesting.
And because if you give a computer, well, like one study I read that I loved gave computers just tons and tons of raw data on children's scores on a zillion tests, but also on the white matter structure in their brains.
Oh, okay.
And they just dumped this into a computer and they said, can you, like, where are the groups? Who are the groups of people that naturally emerge? Where are the clusters? And the computer only found two groups. It found neurotypical and neurodivergent.
Oh.
And the difference between those two big groups were that the neurotypical people had brains that had the hub and spoke network that's more common. That's the one that most airlines use.
Yeah.
And as a result, you only have to take one connecting flight. Usually, if there's not a direct flight, you only have to make one connection, and usually it's geographically sensical.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is what neurotypical brains are like. So to get from your pitch recognition center to your hippocampus, if there's not a direct link, only one connecting stop. So your luggage is not going to get lost. In neurodivergent brains, we have some closer to a daisy chain network. So a bus on a circular route. If you're going from point 1 to 2, great. Like that's a direct flight. But if you're going to point 6, like right before it gets back to 1, then you're going to have to go around that whole loop. And so you're making 5 connections that are extraneous. You are going to lose your luggage along the way. And so as a result, people who are neurodivergent tend to have a handful of highly efficient connections and a lot of really inefficient ones. And this results in a cognitive profile that's very, very spiky. So when I took all these tests as a little kid, they would be very confused because they would say, Sadie, like, why are you scoring in like the top percentile of verbal memory, but the bottom percentile of visual memory? So it's like those things are usually correlated. And so anyway, I think that many people who are neurodivergent get a sense that they are good, very good. There's things that they're excellent at and things that they are very bad at. And in the way, I don't know if everyone does this or if this is just a me thing, but I decided the things I'm excellent at are things that matter, like are the good things. And the things I suck at are things that no one should care about. Right?
That no one should care about.
So it was so interesting, like halfway through, I was more than halfway through. Like I got a book deal, I started working on this thing, and then at the end of the project, I get diagnosed with SDAN. That was the last thing I got. Also, diagnosed is not exactly the right word because Brian Levine, who invented the term, likes to emphasize that my brain is normal. It's a healthy brain. It's not a normal brain, but it is a healthy, functional brain. So I don't have a disorder. I'm just at the far end of normal human variation, or just human, And so,
like evolutionary biology or something.
And so, but that said, I discovered that basically I have the same thing as the guy from Memento or Dory and Finding Dory.
Yeah.
I have the developmental version, so I know how to work around it, and I seem normal, and I can write normally, even though none of those details will ever stick in my head. But let me tell you what happens is, we go to try to buy this old ass truck, and all of a sudden I find myself in what feels like a television farce. And immediately my brain is like, I need to take pictures. I need to take notes. I need to take video or audio. I start acting like a reporter.
Frank thinks he's in a documentary all of a sudden, and he's just trying to sell his car.
Right. I start acting like a reporter, but I'm a reporter about my own life. And this is actually a good strategy for dealing with anything that's highly emotional or aggravating, because those are the moments in your life that are going to be good stories. But in the moment, you can just feel so mired in misery. Yeah. So if you can, if you can I think of it as sort of artistic dissociation, but if you can step outside of yourself and see it from the third person and think about what details you want to remember and you need to remember, it automatically gives you something else to do besides being miserable. And for me, it's really given me great fodder. David Sedaris has a master class where he said, everything is material. So I live by that. My overarching theory of comedy that I'm pretty sure I stole from someone else is that comedy is when someone who does not have the tools to succeed, someone who should not succeed at what they're doing because they are not equipped, does anyway. And in fact, maybe they do it because they lacked those tools. And I find this to be a very life-affirming thing because we're all sort of thrown into this life very ill-equipped, but we're just going to sort of let's bumble through and we're going to try to figure it out. And the fact that sometimes it works out, it's random. You know, you don't deserve it, but it is great. And that to me is what defines comedy. And I am the definition of a situational comedy in that sense, because I rarely have the tools that I need to succeed, but I often do fine, you know, just by blundering my way through and being scrappy and lucky.
Yeah. I thought like an alternate title could have been for the book, which is Do I Know You? Available in bookstores everywhere, probably by the time you're seeing this. Little plug. But I thought an alternate title for the book was one, and maybe this is just me, but was one of the chapter titles, because every chapter has a title. And there's funny ones like Gullibles, Travails, and like just there's puns all through it. But like one of them was Sadie Vision. And I thought that, you know, maybe for the sequel, you could have it called Sadie. That stuck with me as just a really good way of encapsulating your life. But your dad is just like a great. He's a recurring character. You talk about like a situation comedy. He's like that recurring character throughout it. Yeah. Him and Steve, you know, they pop up at different points.
Yeah, I wrote about the people who I love. I know who love me sort of the most, and so they won't complain.
Yeah, and that's, you know, I'm so funny you say that, because that was going to be one of my questions, was like, I wonder how you reconcile this idea of like, you know, for the longest time, and you have by the time you get to college, you have like tons of friends. So this is a happy story, okay? and really based on your dad's advice, right? Because at one point you're like, I'm having trouble making friends, and I don't know if you're in the grocery store and you had just totally dismissed this person who came up to you and said hi, and he's like, well, that was rude. But I can't remember if I'm conflating two things, but at one point he says, just ask people about themselves and get them talking about themselves, and they'll think everyone likes to talk about themselves. Yeah. And they'll, by extension, think you're like the most interesting person they've ever met. And you're like, okay. And you tried it. You end up with like flood of friends, right? Based in part on your dad's advice.
Totally. And the most important thing he told me was really just, you don't have to know who anyone is to like be friendly with them, you know, because when people would start talking to me when I was younger, before I got my dad's excellent advice just to fake it, I would get stressed out, or I'd just walk away. I would dismiss them, like you said. And people found that to be really off-putting and rude. And my dad gave the advice, which a lot of people use, just fake it. And I just threw myself into faking it. And I lost sight of the fact that I didn't know anyone. I didn't, you know, it's such a strange way to live in retrospect. And if you had to like suddenly live that way, I think you would find it very surprising, but it became the fabric of my life.
I started all that by asking a question, and I got, as I sometimes do, I got off track. But my specific question was like, how did you, or maybe still, reconcile the idea that, like, you know, before you went through this journey, you know, you really just didn't believe people when they talked about their like stories from their past that were really vivid. You'd be like, they must be making that up, because there's no way, because everyone sees the world the way I do, and nobody can possibly remember things in that. So I know you're a charitable person, so you didn't think of them as liars, but like at a certain point, like, what did you think everyone was doing? You just thought that was how people got along in the world, I guess, was by just faking a bunch of stuff.
I think that
it must have been, right?
Well, a lot of it, I think I just thought was metaphorical. So when people say, for instance, like they go to sleep by counting sheep, for me, that's 100% exactly the same as just counting. There's no difference. I can't imagine visualizing sheep. And I asked my friend Miriam to describe what the sheep look like to her. And I'm amazed by the specificity and the immediateness of her answer. she can visualize. She's a hyper visualizer.
She's another character in the
and
book.
she sees. Yeah, she's a great character in real life too. She sees these sheep as like she sees them as cartoons, like in a storybook that she thinks she may have read at some point. And it's like a starry night sky, and these like sort of flat green hills and a cartoon fence and these smiling cartoon sheep just like sort of moving over the fence like in a bad animation, like paper cutouts or something. I mean, it's so specific, and that's what sort of convinced me that other people can really visualize, because they can describe these cinematic worlds in their imagination. And I think that's so cool. And so for all the fiction writers out there, I mean, how cool, if you can visualize, how cool that you can actually create this world. I think it's awesome. I'm a little jealous, frankly. But actually, a lot of people with aphantasia, I guess it's probably split like, 30-80, but a minority of people, but like a pretty big group of people are actually pretty sad when they discover that other people can visualize and they can't, because they think, God, like I have loved ones who died and I wish I could revisit them.
Sure,
I wish I could see their faces. And that is sad. I am jealous, but I also learned that from visualizers like Miriam, that they don't have like perfect control over what they visualize. And if they see something horrifying, or if there is a very embarrassing moment in their life, their brain just keeps making them relive that moment. When you put something into a story format in words, it does drain the emotion from it. And it gives you a more analytical distance, like version of it. And without that emotional immediacy, if you don't dredge that back up, you can be in trouble. Like there's a reason why your brain, but on the other hand, I do, even though from a cognitive perspective, I lose information that might be useful to me in the future. I do think like my lizard brain, as they say, like my amygdala is recording something. And so like what my brother says actually is like, you don't need to remember exactly what happened. Just remember the feeling you had. As you know, I went and did the study where they buzzed me at random throughout the day. And I had to write down the contents of my mind in that exact moment before I got buzzed. It was really interesting because it sounds stupid, right?
No,
it sounds like,
makes sense.
I mean, I guess on the face, that part of it kind of made sense to me. But then I had to get on the phone with these two very smart people who really drilled down. And so I would say something like, this is a totally hypothetical example, but I might say, oh, I had a song stuck in my head. And they would want to know what song it was, like how it was playing, if I experienced it as if it was playing on a record.
Wow.
Or if it was, they would just.
You're like, I don't know.
Really, they would.
Too much pressure. Yeah.
But after you learn what kinds of questions they're going to ask, you start paying attention to those kinds of details too.
Sure.
And so if you ask someone about their experience, on one level it could be boring because it's just like, oh, I was just thinking about my dad. But if you drill into that, and this is a fun thing to do with kids actually, because I think they're honest and maybe they have more insight into the more middle steps of their cognition than adults have. Because again, I've got this executive who doesn't want to be bothered with extraneous information.
Right.
The kids are not that organized yet. And so I think that, if someone's like, oh, I'm thinking about my dad, like, okay, are you visualizing him? Like, are you imagining his face floating in space? Are you picturing a particular moment in time? Or even maybe you're remembering a photograph? Or maybe you're just thinking about your dad in like a very abstract way, which is how I would think about my dad. And so I went into that experiment and they asked me what I expected my brain and my mind would be doing most of the time. And I said, well, I'm just a soup of emotions. And I was wrong. I was wrong about myself. Oh. In fact, this happens again and again in this book that honestly, I don't remember writing. Let's be honest. So
that's perfect. Yes. You're like,
but that happens. I know. It happens again and again where I think I know myself, and I really, really don't. And as a result,
Mm.
I don't know anyone else either, because you
Mm.
project you assume everyone else, most people assume everyone else's experience is like theirs. And my experience is very unusual. And so therefore, I've been wrong about almost everyone my entire life.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
like with Miriam, for instance, she takes forever to get over breakups. She will be pining after some guy that she broke up with like 2 years ago.
Mm.
And I could not imagine being that upset. I can't even imagine. I can't even remember like the names of people. I mean, when I was single that I broke up with 2 years ago, like,
Sure. Sure.
and so I just thought she was choosing to be dramatic. But now that I understand the way her mind works, and she's such a vivid visualizer, that she can go and relive like really dramatic moments from her relationship with these people, like good moments or bad moments or moments when things might have taken a turn. She really relives these things, and she is basically like a full scale version of that person living in her head. So I can appreciate how hard it would be to get over a relationship
For
with
sure.
that kind of brain.
People are stereo blind, and I'm using stereo blind as a stand-in for other things like face blind and things like that. A lot of visual artists have that advantage. So can you just, I think maybe as a way to kind of wrap things up, because I think a lot of artists will be hopefully joining us and watching this video. Can you explain how that kind of plays out, maybe even historically with famous artists who have been sort of diagnosed retroactively with some of this stuff?
Yeah, it's really interesting that someone like, I'm trying to think of the names of these artists. I had a whole litany of them.
Some of them are in the book,
Um,
actually. So maybe,
yeah, Man Ray, I want to say Rembrandt, Van Gogh, all had visibly misaligned eyes. This Harvard researcher named Margaret Livingstone looked at all of their self-portraits and saw that they had misaligned eyes. And then you might think, okay, but maybe they're just bad at lining up the eyes in their portrait. So she actually looked at art students, and she found that the visual arts students were more likely to be stereo blind than the general
yes.
population. And so basically, yeah, if you live in a two-dimensional world, then that gives you a leg up in putting that image on canvas on a flat, if you live in a two-dimensional world, it's easy to depict it on canvas, or on a two-dimensional surface on a photograph. And she f- and this is why when people draw, they often close an eye, because
Oh,
that makes
yeah, they
you,
kind
that
of line it
flattens the
up,
world
right?
a little bit.
Yeah, with stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you flatten the world. But the thing is, the flattening of the world that you get by closing one eye is still not as flat as my world,
Interesting.
because you have a lifetime of experience filling in
Mm,
the details and learning how to infer space. And you perceive space in like a palpable way that I don't. I almost perceive space as like a bunch of a series of like sort of screens,
mm.
if that makes
Sure.
sense. Like there's just little slices of things.
That's really
And
interesting. So like a series of like maybe flat screen TVs, like progressively
yeah,
going into the distance kind of thing.
yeah, I think that's closer.
That's
That would
interesting.
be what it would be if you beamed into my brain. That's what the world would
Okay.
look like to you, I think.
Sort of like one of
Yeah.
those pop-up books that we all had as kids, like where it's all 2D, but there's like, it kind of has a progression.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly
It's
right. I
3D,
think that's
but
exactly what.
so that might not be the best example, but
No, I mean it's like I have an inferred sense of three dimensions because I can see things occlude other things, obviously. But your brain is actually able to calculate those
interesting.
distances, and so you feel the people who have learned to see in 3D as adults say that all of a sudden trees become sculptures,
Mm,
and there's this palpable sense of space in the folds of fabric and in your whole world. All of a sudden space almost has its own physical entity.
interesting.
um yeah, I think that's super cool. I would love to experience it. I'm still working on it.
Some people have been able to, it's very rare, but been able to teach themselves to see in 3D.
Yeah,
And, there's some, if I remember correctly, there's some, it's a little bit controversial because maybe like some people theorize that those people I don't know. How did you put it?
Oh, I can totally explain this quickly, I
Yes,
think.
go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, it's interesting because of all of my different brain differences, the one that's most fundamental is the fact that my brain does not combine my two fields of vision into a single
Right.
field in my experience. I'm always looking, quote unquote, out of one eye or the other eye, even though both my eyes are open, and people assume that I'm looking at them, assuming, and one eye isn't just wandering off and doing its own thing. So this is all to say that people thought that you could only learn how to integrate your two fields of vision during a very critical period, a very small critical period, because children develop stereo vision suddenly at about 4 months. And your brain, it's sort of like a basic, it's the first step in vision. In terms of like the layers of your occipital cortex, which is your vision cortex in the back of your head. The very first thing your brain does is take the information from each eye, line it up, and then it calculates information from there. So if your brain is messing up at that very first step, everything that happens afterwards is going to be messed up. So this is all to say that if I learned to see in 3D now, apparently it would be an amazing experience, and things would shift for me in a experiential way. But I would not see in 3D like someone who's done it their entire life, because you guys have this amazing, you got your brain set up right to begin with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the two, that's what really struck me. And that was another really interestingly, a kind of a visual, I guess, part of the book was like when you're talking about switching to the different, like and combining it into one stream. I thought that was just real, that you really brought that to life. And it could have been very dry and boring actually, but just how you did it just there, you really brought it to life. This is a good moment to pitch the book one last time. Do I Know You by Sadie Dingfelder. It's going to be out in bookstores everywhere. And as you know, maybe that's a good place to wrap it up and talk about, you have a couple of launch events coming up. Do you want to talk and do some plugs there?
Oh yes, thank you for asking. In New York on Publication Day, which is Tuesday, June 25th at Lofty Pigeon Bookstore, you can hang out with me and Rachel DePace, who is an exceptionally good comedy writer, and we'll be chatting about our respective books. And there will be a cake with a book cake, a cake that looks like a book.
Great.
And same deal in DC on the 27th at Busboys and Poets K Street. But it will be me and Alexandra Petrie, which is very exciting because it's the night of the presidential debate. Ooh. So you can ask her how she prepares to watch them and that
very
kind of
cool.
thing.
Very cool. Yeah. And shortly thereafter, the book will be in wide release, correct? People can get it wherever they get books?
It's being released on the 25th, so you can pre-order it today. You can get it on Amazon, on your favorite indie bookstore website or location. And great. Get my book. It's great. Also, there's an audiobook, so you can just hear me talking if you like the sound of my voice.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. You should start a podcast. I know you probably don't want to, but start a podcast, you and Miriam. And then you'll invite your dad in every once in a while. You'll invite Steve, Saul, these characters who we've all come to know and love in this book. Should come make little entrances into your podcast. I think that'd be fun. But I
know, I kind of think it'd be fun too, but you podcasters are so hardworking. I don't know if I have that level of
I think it's harder
effort.
To be a guest. I sit here, I do my preparation, but you're the expert, right? So I just, I'm like a stand-in for the audience is the way I look at it. So, and I was the audience for this actually, because I read the book. So I encourage everyone to go out and read it ASAP, starting June 25th, 2024. Thank you so much, Sadie. Yay! It's so good to reconnect with you, and let's have you back and kind of fill us in on the progress of the book later on as it's read by more and more people.
Oh, I've got so many good stories to tell you.
Yeah, that's what you say at the end.
So many weird
There's
things.
so many things that didn't make it into the book, so that could be the fodder for your podcast and the sequel book. So all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.